Hello and welcome to the second part of the CM4D basic training module for graphs. I wanted to extend that module to talk about and show target charts and polar charts for CM4D. So in the previous module we saw how we could make box and whisker graphs, histogram graphs, and benchmark graphs. Benchmark being the one that you see here. But there's a few others that are also important in specific situations. One is a target chart, which functions kind of like a bullseye that plots two axes or two dimensions in a x and y plane. So to see something like that, first what we can do is make a data set that can be, actually, no, we don't actually have to use a data set. Target charts are a bit unique in that they don't connect directly to a data set, but connect directly to the query in order to work. So for a target chart, we could basically go here to Sheets. I'm going to make a new sheet set, call this Graph Annotations Target Charts. I'm going to hit OK. And then here, what we'll do is click on the graph icon, and I'm going to draw a box for the graph to make the base annotation. So in order to activate a target chart, we would have to go to Properties, and here for a graph type, we'd have to choose Target. Typically, we go to Data Source and connect to source of data, but in the case of target charts, we would be connecting directly to the query and then picking one of the points for the feature dropdown. So before we do that, we'll go back to the Graph tab. Here where it says Setup, we'll click that. And here you specify the two characteristics or the two dimensions that you would like to graph. In the case of what I'm making, I would like to connect to a whole point, and so I'd like to see what the deviations look like within the plane of the whole. And in CM4D, the secondary and tertiary characteristics are what define the plane of the whole. So if we go here, if each hole is different or is in a different orientation based on the vector values ijk, what we can do is choose secondary and then tertiary here. So these two coordinates would be what are in the plane of the whole. The primary would be the vector or the direction that's perpendicular to that. So we'll choose those. And then here in data source, we would go to query, and here under feature, I can click and choose individually a particular feature. So I know that the points that start with H are whole features or that type, SMI type, so I'll click there on whole for that one. And if I just keep last sample, we'll see what that looks like. So if you notice, there's a grid structure here and it has a circle that's close to the middle. This is trying to plot the data for the secondary and tertiary axes for this whole. So of course we can modify this chart to make it a bit more visible and readable. For instance, I can right click and go to edit. That would take me into the different elements of the chart. And if I right click again, there's a second element in here for the target chart. I can go to edit for that. And now I can click on the plot space itself and minimize that. So now that I'm out of edit mode for the target chart, I'm still in edit mode for the chart. So I can grab this element, which is the default text box, and expand that and resize that. There's other things you could put in here, like other text boxes if I wanted to show deviations or any type of statistic, but right now I'll keep it a basic chart that looks like that. And then this here is a indicator called high, low, and out. And what this does is it looks at the two dimensions being plotted, and it will put within here, depending on the dimension, whether it's X, Y, or Z, the directions for high, low, in, out, or fore, aft. So that's just an automatic accessory that's part of this type of chart. So if I want to update this a little, I can. I'm going to go to Properties. I'm going to click on Chart, go to the plot space. Here I'm going to set this, instead of auto, this represents deviations, and typically you wouldn't have a deviation that's of a very large size with data, so we could set this to be a minimum of -2, positive of 2, and then for the top area do the same thing, minimum of 2, positive of 2, which it's doing there. We can add some lines, so if we go to lines, I can turn on spec control limits so that I can see what the spec limits are. Since we're plotting two different dimensions, it would combine the two into a circle in order to show what the area is for values in tolerance plotted within this 2D space. So if I click here on style, I can change the color. I'll do red with dashes, and then some of these I can turn off, like the mean or inner feature. Instead, I think what I'll use is the nominal 0, and hit OK, OK. And so now this is showing me what the target area is, combining the secondary and tertiary dimensions for this point, and that the point is actually on the outside. So if we wanted to change the marker for that, we could by going back to edit for the chart, plot space, going to top area, and here we could go to series. So I could change what it looks like while it's in tolerance. So that's the marker shape. Maybe change the size to 2. The style I could make green, and no diagonal or cross hatchings. And then if it's out of tolerance or beyond limit, I could set that to also be 2. Perhaps make that hollow X and make the brush for that to be red. Oh, looks like it would not change the marker there. So maybe that option doesn't function for the target chart in this case. Yeah, it looks like that doesn't function for this. So you would just have the marker as it is, and you'd see whether it's out of tolerance or in tolerance for this type of chart. So right now it's looking at just one sample based on the chart properties. If we go back to here, properties, data source, we told it to look at this feature at the last sample from the query. I could say all samples, and what we should see is a series of dots that chart where they are within the two dimensions plotted here in this 2D plane for the secondary and tertiary axes for this point. So if I wanted to see this for a different point, I could go here to the data source, choose a different drop down. I'd see different set of coordinates and a different visual representation of where they fall in 2D space in that plane. Now, of course, if we had a view, we could attach this and have it point to the place where this data is taken. So if I clicked here and drew a view, I can right click, go to properties, go to leader, turn this on, have it point to the name of the view, which is view 1, and draw to wherever this particular hole happens to be. So in a way, due to the marker down at the bottom, we can see that this is the ZY plane that the hole is in. So Z and Y would be the tertiary and secondary axes that are being plotted here for the data. And those two combined, it kind of gives you the location of where the actual measured touch of the hole was, as opposed to a perfect measurement, which would be in the center of the chart. So that's some of the main functions of a target chart in case a customer wants something outside of just a trend chart to show data. If this was trend information, you would have two trend charts next to each other, one showing maybe the Y measurements, the other showing the Z measurements, in order to relay similar information as to what's being shown here. So the next type of chart is a polar chart, and that's similar to this target chart. What we can do is first, to use polar charts, it uses what's known as polar data. So there's two types of features that it can use. One is called a constructed feature, that it's a constructed polar feature. A constructed feature is one that has that's not measured directly by your output device and included in the file, but one that is a relationship that can be created in CM4D between other features. So for instance, we have here a series of points. This is a hole, this is a hole, this is a hole, and this is a hole. What we'll do is double click, and let's see, we will use the feature to select areas by features by area, And I'm going to hold Control, highlight, these 4 points. And then I'm going to say push selected features. So this says to data source, to reference, to subroutine, or new subroutine. I'm going to say reference, but in order to do that, I need an actual new feature that's going to be the basis for these 4 reference features. So to do that, what we can do is use what's known as the feature editor. So I'm going to click here, this feature editor. This gives you access to the nominals for the different features. So in order to use that, make sure that none of the objects are selected on the white space. I'm going to click here on feature editor, and I'm going to expand this. And I'm going to click here on new feature, call this polar test, and the type is going to be polar. And then we'll hit finish. If I look in the feature list, I have that polar test that's been created, and I have here reference features. One of the things I'm going to do as well, if you notice, it already creates a nominal for polar. And I'm going to make a limit for this. So this will be a polar limit. I'm going to make the spec limit. Call this, let's see, relative. And for polar data, let's see here. Okay, so it looks like instead of having bilateral, what we really need to do is perhaps say absolute unilateral high, since polar values, they'll only have an upper spec limit. And we can make this 1. And let's see, I think I'll make a second spec limit for this as well. Create limit. Polar spec limit 2. Absolute unilateral high. Make that also 1. The reason is for constructed polar features. Basically, it is a feature that keeps track of the relationships between a series of holes that you assign to it as reference features, and will try to calculate the smallest circle that encloses all of the locations of the deviations in polar coordinates for those holes. So there's a smallest circle that encloses called a mini ball, and then there is the smallest circle that encloses but centered on 0, 0 for the grid lines for the chart. That's known as the 0 ball. And these 2 spec limits are for those 2 circles that will be drawn to illustrate the limits or tolerances in polar coordinates for those series of points. So we'll just define those there. This comes defined already. Reference features I could add in, but what I want to do is just create the polar feature here. I'll either hit commit changes, or I can just hit close. And if I go back to my view here and go into edit mode, I still have this select features by area. So I'll click that, and again I will hold Control and highlight these 4 holes. And then once that's done, I have this other option, push selected features. So it's showing me the 4 points that I highlighted. I can say push to reference, and those will be the reference features for the polar constructed feature that I just made. So with that, I just created a polar construction feature. What I will do is now make a new page. So I'm going to go here to Sheet Sets, and I'm going to right click and say New Sheet. I'm going to call this Graph Annotations Polar Charts. And on that new sheet, I can make a polar chart, but first I also have to make sure there is a data set that has the proper point data in there to display that. So I think there's one other thing I want to do. I also want to show or add in a nominal for polar for one of the whole points, because I don't believe that was done before. So I'm going to click here on this point, click here on nominals. I have XYZ diameter IJK, but I don't have a polar nominal. So I'm going to click create nominal, and I'm going to choose polar. Value will be 0, no significance, and we'll hit OK. So that gets created. I'll hit close on that. So now what I want to do is make a new data set that's just for those polar values. The one hole that I added the polar nominal, and for the polar constructed feature. So I'll say polar data. And in the sift rules, I'm going to turn on just the hole. And here I'll say polar. And then I'm going to turn off these other categories except for the polar here. So now I have one category for whole points, and I will display polar data, and then there's a category for polar constructed features displaying polar data. So I have my categories turned on. I'm going to go to data source and choose the query, and here I'm going to go to list and actually just find the 2 points in question. So first one I believe that I added the nominal to was this point, and then the constructed feature that I made was this polar test. So I'm going to add those 2 in. I'll just say last sample for now. So now if I right click on this data set, view data set in grid, I see that I have data for both points in here for the last sample. So again, I just want to go into the feature editor, check on that polar polar test. I see that the reference features are still there, so that's fine. So to actually use the polar chart, we'll go to Graph. I would make a box for a polar chart, right click, go to Properties, and here for graph type I would choose Polar. Here we have some setup for some other options, but for now we'll just choose Polar and then go to Data Source. In this case I'm going to connect to Polar Data. I'm going to use the first row, and it's going to display a point in space for that first row in the data set. If I held Control and dragged, I'm going to get the next chart, which is for the constructed feature that I created that had the 4 reference features. So what you're seeing here is it's calculating what's known as the mini ball that encloses the 4 reference feature points, and it's mapping the polar deviations of those 4 points in space and showing you the smallest circle that encloses those. The reason for something like this was for customers that knew that there was some variation in the placement of a hole, but they wanted to make sure that if there was an offset, the pattern of different holes in combination was within a certain tolerance for itself. So that perhaps if you had holes arranged in a circle where another part fit into, if that pattern itself moved left or right or shifted, the other part would still fit into it because the pattern is the same. So it's a way of tracking, I guess, the shape of or the relationship between holes and not just the deviation of one particular hole. So again, if we want to arrange how this looks, we can do that. I can right click and go to Properties, go to the component for chart, go to the plot space, hit edit. Right now this is using auto reporting. So we could continue to have it do that if we want, or we can put in variables or just plain numbers in order to change what the plot looks like in the 2 dimensions, the horizontal and the vertical. And then if we go to top area, again we can change what the series markers look like. We can go to lines, add in what the spec limit lines might be. Put in the nominal line. So it does at the nominal line. The other ones for spec limits, those are actually changed in another area now. If we go to Properties and go here to Setup, there's some new options here that apply just for these polar charts. The mini ball is the smallest enclosing circle for the deviations that are plotted. You could say display mini ball limit. That would be the tolerance there. So that one we could choose different color, and a different style. So if we did that, hit OK. Let's see, in this case, do I have a limit for the polar data? Let's see, if I go back to my, click on the chart and go to Feature Editor, looks like I don't have a polar limit, so let me create that. Make that one. And I'm going to make a second limit for polar, spec limit 2. Unilateral high, also make that one. So now that I added the polar limit or spec limit in, it's able to draw the enclosing circle for that data. So this is a single point. It's showing what that would look like. If I wanted to see more points plotted for this single characteristic, or see other details by going back to the chart, going to Setup, I can display zero ball as well, and basically change the colors for that. Display data markers, and then data beyond the mini ball or zero ball limit. There's only one point, so it's displaying a very small mini ball there. If I go here to polar data, the data set, go to data source and choose all samples instead of just last, I'm going to see multiple markers here that indicate the polar deviation for each sample for this particular hole. And these indicators that you see here are the tolerances for the mini ball and for the zero ball. So zero ball is centered on the origin line, mini ball just being the enclosing tolerance centered on the cluster of the mini ball. So that's one way of displaying data. Another way of displaying the information is within the chart that is tracking constructed features. If you see here in this chart, we have a lot going on. That's because we changed the dataset properties. I'm going to change this back to looking at the last sample. And again, what this is doing is plotting for the 4 points that are the reference features for this constructed polar feature. It's showing where they are in relation to each other. So if I want to copy the properties of what I did here onto here, I can do that by clicking on this chart, holding Shift and right-clicking on this one and saying Copy Properties. Now I've copied the properties of the previous chart onto this one so that I can see the mini ball display as well as the zero ball display for the measured and the nominals. The colors can change, of course, if I wanted to do that. I could go here to Setup, mini ball limit, that's right now set to red. The zero ball limit, that can be set to some other color, say green or blue, what other color you would like, and it would change those accordingly. Same for the mini ball and the zero ball themselves. So the mini ball could be black, the zero ball could be green, and there it would give you a slightly different indication for the different values. So those are the two ways that polar charts can be used, either to plot one feature and maybe look at multiple features, or plot a constructed feature that has multiple reference holes and look at the relationship between those holes. If I separated this by duplicating, I can call that polar data. I'll call this polar constructed data. And then making this polar graph look at this data set. I can now change the sample option so that for polar data, I can look at all samples. And then for polar test, I can look at that single sample, or if I wanted to look at more than one, I can say all samples but the last 1 through 2. And now I'd be looking here at 2 different plots. So for 2 different samples, it's showing what the relation would be. And for the second sample, it automatically generates the different feature markers that you see, which could get a bit noisy in the chart the more samples as you have, as we saw before. If we turn this off and just say all samples, there's a lot to see. So this might be best shown looking at just one sample at a time, or changing what the sample is through this option here. We can pick a particular sample and have it just look at that one to plot that information for these reference features and this constructed feature. So those are, again, 2 other chart types that are a bit more involved when it comes to setting them up: the target chart and the polar chart. But again, for customers that want a bit more visual indication outside of just a trend chart for data, these are good for helping them locate where in a 2D plane deviation for a particular hole might be. So with that, we'll stop this module, and thank you for attending. We will move on to the next one.